I'm messing up my questions. Let's talk about. Hi everyone, welcome back to Poetology. Today's interview is about Alice Hiller's Bird of Winter, her first poetry collection. We discuss how to write about difficult personal subject matter and her use of visual poetry, collage, and erasure to tackle her medical archive. This is an intense interview, so please take care of yourself as you watch. I'd like to give a content warning for childhood sexual abuse, incest, and anorexia. We also talk about how healing poetry and literature can be for people who have experienced difficult circumstances. I hope you enjoy this interview, and I'll see you at the other side.
Hi, really good to be here with you, and thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. I'm really happy to have you, and I can't wait to discuss your collection, Bird of Winter. Do you want to introduce yourself briefly before we start?
Yes, I'm Alice Hiller. I'm a poet and writer. I am currently 59 years of age, and I started writing poetry the year I turned 50, so a decade ago. And I had written as a journalist before that. I'd done a PhD, but the subject I really needed to write about was my experience of childhood sexual abuse. And it took me until I was 50 to find a form of words that would allow me to do that. I tried to write about it in my 40s through a novel, and I'd realized that actually the experience is so extreme, I have to own it as my own story. But at the same time, I needed to find a form of art making that would let me do so in a way that didn't overwhelm me or the person who received the story. And I'm very open about my age because I think it's important for each of us to say where we are in our life journey in a culture which can overly validate youth. So yes, I am here at 59 at the moment.
Yeah, that's a great point. And how long it can take for,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very, very usual with people working with complex materials to have a long journey into words. And just before we started this conversation, I touched on the fact that we both feel very strongly the appalling situation that's happening in Gaza. And as someone who lives in the long aftermath of trauma, on both the family I married into and my family of origin, we lost extended family members to the Holocaust or Shoah. So I am very aware that when bad things are intentionally done to people, the people suffer terribly in the present and wrongly, but more catastrophically, that harm travels down through the generations as well. And so there's a sort of refracting horror when I see the news each morning, when I stand in solidarity with Gaza, thinking that they are intentionally being harmed, but they are also intentionally resisting and forming acts of community, acts of articulation, acts of solidarity. And that sense of reaching to words, refusing silence, is integral to my practice. But I think it's also integral to our practice as human beings. We've existed in community, ever since we climbed down from trees, and we need to remember that and stand together.
Thanks for mentioning this, Alice. It's so important. So you've already mentioned that your poetry collection touches upon really personal subjects like childhood sexual abuse and incest. I would like to know what the process was like for you in terms of finding your voice and the vulnerability it implies.
I wrote everything else I could think of before I wrote about it. So I was a journalist. I did a PhD. I wrote non-fiction. I wrote a book, The History of the T-shirt. I tried to write a novel in my 40s. And then I actually was diagnosed with ovarian cancer when I was 47. And the first poem I ever wrote, I wrote sitting in a park after I had the scan that revealed the tumor. And it was the only form of words that was broken and whole enough to hold what I was going through. And as I progressed, I ended up having 3 big operations, and it was almost literally my silence was cut out of me. I was abused by my mother. I had ovarian cancer. I had a very, very large ovarian tumor because from 2006 to 2011, my GP had told me I was somatizing the childhood sexual abuse. And so I was literally, cut open into words. I really can't describe it any other way. And being in the experience of the scanner, it was an MRI scan. So you lie, and I had this really large mass. You lie in this sort of tunnel of ricocheting sound, and it was almost like I was refracting into hearing myself. I was refracting into imagining the mass that the sound was sort of bouncing off. And then I went out and made this poem sitting on a park bench. I just said it out loud, and so it's a primitive way into words, but it's very authentic.
Wow, what a start. And how did you feel while writing? Did you have to take care of yourself in certain ways?
I still do, yes, very much so. I'm working on this in a new book. One of the most interesting thing about trauma is that it fractures the self into multiple parts. And so I exist at multiple ages within my single adult 59-year-old self. And I'm not saying this in a new age way. And at different times, I can access different voices of different ages, but I can also access, or rather they bring themselves to me, different physical selves, different injured physical selves. And generally when I'm writing and revising, and also when I'm preparing to perform certain poems, those physical selves, those old injuries, can manifest themselves in my body. So I'm literally writing out of that experience. But I meditate, I swim, I walk, I work with a lit candle. It's a very precarious and dangerous process. And it's one of the reasons that whenever I teach workshops, whenever I do anything, I don't work directly with trauma. And I always put a lot of safeguarding in, because I'm aware that people need to be taken care of and need to take care of themselves.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So in that process of becoming a poet yourself, who were your influences?
So I was so happy when you asked me about my influences, because I am someone who has read since I can remember. And I'd kind of like to talk a little in detail about these influences, because voices are my influences. When I was reading aged 8, after my father died, when the penetrative abuse was sort of nightly by my mother, I was reading Laura Ingalls Wilder by day, who wrote about her family's, now problematic incursion into Indian territory, into Native American territory. But as a child, I saw a family with a protective father. And then I read historical fiction. I read Rosemary Sutcliffe. I entered into a series of alternative worlds given by my reading, and those let me know that there was more than one reality. You could elect to create a story which held you. So that it's really deep. And I sort of read other stuff as I grew older. I read Spare Rib, which was a iconic feminist magazine as a teenager. I caught the very last of the sort of 70s feminism. And that was when I was coming out of hospital, getting over anorexia. And again, it was talking about your body, about your queer body, in a way that didn't conform to the very conventional upbringing I had, which sort of concealed these atrocities. And then I met Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou. Toni Morrison's beloved, Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And they were just like lightning rod texts for me, because Maya Angelou speaks directly about the experience of having lived beyond, being muted by sexual abuse, and then reclaiming herself. Toni Morrison's beloved sort of finds a form of words for an experience which defies articulation. So they were like opening the field of possibility. And then I read Primo Levi, If This Is a Man, The Periodic Table as a teenager. So that sense of holding the Holocaust, holding the Shoah, but also I think what really interested me about If This Is a Man, which is the sort of aftermath of the concentration camps as well, was As someone who'd been subjected to sexual abuse, as someone who'd gone down to 4.5 stone, which I think is 28 kilos with anorexia, as someone who'd been shut in a room and made to go use a commode in front of a nurse, not allowed to use a toilet, as someone, you know, who had been repeatedly raped, as someone who had a very troubled adolescent self, people writing about extreme experiences, being in a concentration camp, being subject to enslavement, those were where I found myself. Those were where I knew it was okay to be me, that I was still human, because some of the conventional discourse suggested that what I had been through made me subhuman or inhuman. And some of the medical professionals I encountered as a teenager reiterated that message. So those were big gestures of hope. And then Elizabeth Bishop has been a fantastic influence since my early 20s. And what I love about her work, it's again non-binary, or it has a sort of queer consciousness, but also her poems are gifts. They build a world on the page for the reader to enter collaboratively, and that's what I seek to do. I'm not Elizabeth Bishop, I can't write like her, but it's taking that model of building a world and letting the reader walk into it and find it on their own terms. So those are all in the summer I decided to become a poet. I went to see Anna Blandiana, and I found the ticket at Poetry International, and Anna Blandiana is a Romanian poet, and she read live, and that was outstanding. I already knew Herta Müller, who is a Romanian writing in German, who I read in an English translation, Her Land of the Green Plums, again, talking about Romania under Ceausescu, finding a figurative language to make a middle ground where people who had experienced something and people who hadn't experienced something could collaborate imaginatively. That was very, very important. And I read a lot of contemporary poetry. Nicole Seeley's Ordinary Beast was a big deal for me, but I can't really think of contemporary poetry as an influence. I see it as a nourishment. I think the influences are the stuff that you meet at critical points in your life, often quite young. You know, so for me, what I read as a child, in my teens, in my 20s, in my 30s. So yeah, I've got so many books. There are books on my stairs, there are books in my bathroom. There is, you know, I live in book world. Yeah, I read a lot, and I am nourished by every writer I read.
It's amazing how much of a lifeline literature can be for some of us.
I think so. I really think so. I think it is a huge gift of possibility, and also of non-normativeness. You know, if you grow up in an environment which isn't you and which doesn't love you, you need to live. You know, you need to find the love somewhere.
That's so true. What was the process of going through your medical archive, and what motivated you to work directly with that material?
It's a really interesting question. It's a very vexed question, not least because I was never, ever allowed to see my original medical file when it was at my GP. They would never let me look at it. And they promised that when I changed GP, they would send it to the next GP, and instead it vanished. So I have this photocopy, you know, that's as thick as it is, of what wasn't vanished. So, you know, luckily I got them. It's very incomplete. I'll never know if they photocopied everything or not. They had it, but what absolutely tormented me was that they had it like in the same building where this doctor had told me for 6 years I didn't have ovarian cancer, and they wouldn't allow me the grace to look at it. Having got that off my chest, I was very apprehensive about looking at my medical notes. I was really frightened of the selves I might meet there, and I was frightened of what I would find about what doctors had said to me. So I requested them. They rang me to say they were ready. I waited a sensible 6 weeks, and then I went to collect them. I took them home and I put them on a shelf, and I left them for 18 months. And I thought, well, you know, this is the wise approach, you know, creep up. And what I found there was wonderful and terrible in equal measure. I don't have anything physical. I have a necklace from my grandmother, but I have nothing else from my childhood. And I don't have contact with people from my childhood. So these photocopies of notes were the only connection I had with that actual time. And I had no idea what they would say. And what was so fascinating, the first one went into pistol. This is what it looks like. I'm holding it up. This I put into pistol, has been well since I'm 2, apart from German measles in France. Difficult with medicines, aggressive and difficult with other children, bites and scratches, difficult to get off to sleep at night, i.e. spoiled, attention paid by a vast number of adults. And so what was so interesting was that my mother took me to her English doctor. We lived in Paris at the time because my father was a diplomat. So the narrative about me, the difficult child, was I'm hearing how my mother described me. This doctor had never met me. She just wrote it down. And you can tell it's just notes. So this mother, who really was not keen on me, this is my mother's voice speaking. So that was very extraordinary. It was also really interesting. I'm a mother. I have 2 adult children, and I know what 2-year-olds are like. If they have been taken care of with love, they don't tend to go around biting and scratching. And so I was a child who was frightened by the bodily presence of other children and reacted defensively. And the other thing, the final line was, which I didn't fit into the poem, attention paid by a vast number of adults. So this is obviously my mother being pissed off that my father and my grandmother. So she's saying, of course she's spoiled. Her father and her grandmother had too much attention. So it was an incredible gift, and it was a huge blow both at once. And the anorexia stuff was really interesting. I mean, it's like, I think because it was a big file, they just did sample letters. So I'll get something and then nothing. There's the run up to the anorexia when I stopped eating. I was having sort of terrible stomach problems. That was when I stopped eating when I was 13 to end the abuse. But again, you get the sense of a distressed child. The teenage stuff is really interesting. There's more of my horrible mother's comments. There's very dismissive comments by doctors, etc. So it told me that what I remembered was absolutely correct. Unfortunately, it was very painful to hear that, but it was also liberating. I'm not saying this with tears running down my face. I'm saying this looking straight at you. But it's medical records are really, really tricky, and they have an extraordinary power to wound, because they show, particularly for us who are older, now doctors are much, much more circumspect. The records are online that doctors know you'll be able to read them. When I was growing up, the doctors had no sense of that you might ever read them, and they didn't care if you did. So historic medical records are really explosive. And anyone who's thinking of calling theirs up, I would just say absolutely do it, but really safeguard yourself at the same time if you think there's something there that will be hard for you to read.
Yeah, that's good advice.
And it's from the heart. And you were going to say about form, I use cut up, I use erasure, and I actually thought, my goodness, we're going to talk about the poems. How many are there? And what was fascinating, I went through Bird of Winter. There were 4 poems which directly arise from the medical records. They're all informed by them. The first is Pistol, which is from my childhood. The second is Tessellation, which is from when I had anorexia. The third is Delicately Open, which is a kind of opening a papyrus, a carbonized papyrus, and trying to read it. And also it's all scribbled over and cut up. It's my teenage medical records. And then Mothered is the ovarian cancer. So it's just 4 medical record poems, but they absolutely span the arc of my experience. Mothered is a direct quote, but the others are all cut-ups or erasures, or both. So, and you've just heard why they might well be cut-ups or erasures or both. She says, shall we just do some erasing and some cutting up? So yeah, I mean, medical records can be acts of violence, and they can record acts of healing, but the terms in which they do so can be acts of violence. And I think I wasn't going to take them lying down. I was going to take them scissors in hand, blackout pen in hand. I was going to take them fully armed, and I was going to present them on my own terms. So yeah, so that's why they come in that form, she says very firmly.
Yeah, that's great. And it makes your pamphlet very interesting visually. I can just like show some erasure here, for example, or
Yeah. This is the delicately open. Yes, exactly. And it's really, that was the papyruses are really fascinating because the manuscripts, they were stored in rolls and they were carbonized by the intense heat, and they were in a very opulent villa called the Villa dei Papyri after them. And one of the great challenges has been different ways, and they tried like soaking them and unrolling them very gently. They're now using MRI scanning, and so that was so fascinating for me that actually the scanners that detected my tumor and allowed the surgeons to plan my surgery are also the scanners that are, you know, reading the papyri by looking without hurting. And I became sort of very interested in that. I mean, it's called Delicately Open, that one, and silk threads are attached. And then another phrase is I'm just trying to see, you know, insomnia, highly fragile. I really scratched these out hard because the teenage stuff was so harsh. Defied all attempts, give her 10 Dalamain, have not seen her since, because like I couldn't sleep, I was having these terrible nightmares, etc., etc. So they were giving me sleeping pills, helped by a psychiatrist. It's deep in infrared rays. I just wanted this to be the sort of the mess of it all. She said, you know, just the mess of, I wanted a physical representation of the difficulty of reconstructing our narratives and the necessity of doing so, however incomplete and fragmented that reconstruction might be, because then it involves an act of interpretation and an act of creation. And in a sense, in transmitting or receiving material equally, that interpretation and transmission is needed. And I think one of the things that strongly interests me is the idea of the creative presence of the reader, that the text is nothing without the reader, and that the two actors, the creator of the text and the recipient of the text via this third-party medium, meet together in an act of chosen interaction. So yes, again, the cut-ups, all that thing, really enact that process.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to add anything about Bird of Winter that we haven't said?
I think the one thing you asked me was our support networks, and two things were really helpful to me. I was awarded a Jerwood Arvon, I think it was, I get mixed up by all the charities, but anyway, I had a year of mentoring with Pascal Petit. Pascal Petit is a fantastic poet. She also experienced childhood sexual abuse and a very, very fractured upbringing, which she explores through the art she makes. And that was a gift beyond all gifts, because she's a fantastic editor. She used to be poetry editor at Poetry London. She has a very sharp eye. She has a very strong instinct. She has a very strong creative presence. She used to be a visual artist. I'm strongly engaged by visual art. So if the universe wanted to give me anyone, that's who I would have asked for. And the universe was kind that day. And I met Seraphima Kennedy, Romalyn Ante, and Yvonne Reddick with the other poetry mentees. So we were a micro community. And then one thing, you know, I wasn't in a position financially to do a poetry MA. I'd used up my funding on doing a lit crit PhD, you know, years ago. So the government funding. And one of the things that exercised me about poetry is that it is not a remunerative medium financially, but it can be a costly one. Like if you pay for seminars, you pay for classes, whatever. And I just thought we have to have a payment-free channel. So I set up an informal workshop for people working with complex materials such as myself. Before the pandemic, we started meeting the Poetry Society upstairs. We then went to the foyer of the National Theatre, and then we went online with the pandemic. We now have 65 members. We meet once a month online. I run a live workshop and a feedback workshop and a discussion group, support and discussion group for creative matters. And there's also an email swap and a newsletter. I set this up at the beginning of my quote unquote poetry journey. And the idea was that we would upskill each other. And when we started, none of us have published, and a lot of us have published now. It's very strong, it's very alive. There's real loyalty between our members, and that model of collaborative working. So we're not psychotherapy, we don't offer that. We're a creative resource, but those are my people, and I give thanks to them, and the new work I'm doing is also going through them.
So what is that new work you are doing?
I'm working on a new kind of companion to Bird of Winter, called I Am Colour, and it looks at my life from 0 to 18 through a series of colours. And the idea is that the white light of day's denial tried to erase what was happening to me. But memory is the prism that can bend and slow that white light into revelation. And each of the segments is called for a colour. It's prefaced by a poem, a very short poem that has that colour in, and 5 sentences about that colour, which I then strip through the essay that follows. And I've been working on it for several years now. And the idea is really, it's like an act of sewing. I can't sew to save my life, but I wanted to sort of create a prose tracking that could hold these multiple fragmented selves that I am sequentially, so that other people could walk that journey and maybe understand their own multiple fragmented selves. So that's my primary task. And I do the odd interview and things, but it's my primary task at the moment is just trying to stitch that together. I want a loosely knitted but coherent arc. And what was fascinating is I started in my babyhood working with very sparse materials, helpful medical records, and I really saw how what was done to me was positioned really from the kind of first breath I drew. And I think the terrible thing about your abuser being your mother is it means that the person who gave you life, in my case, also was pretty keen to give you death. So that's a really major challenge to survival. But I am 59 and so far successful. But it wasn't a scout leader. It wasn't someone who observed me from afar. It was someone who was bedded into the tissues of my body, the structure of my life. So I can really trace minutely the long sweep of positioning and grooming, seeing how the power dynamic was changed when my father developed motor neurone disease, when he died, when we changed country, and then how I broke free of it, and how during my teens, as I tried to maintain my freedom and develop it, she sought to manipulate, create circumstances that would push me backwards. And it just seems to me that that long arc, when you say childhood sexual abuse, people's mind goes to the moment in the bedroom, in the locker room, wherever. The reality is that is a pin in this bigger arc. And the reason that we need to think about the arc is that we need to think about the fact that this is a crime that impacts a whole life, that we are never entirely free of. To understand it, and to understand also the disturbed behaviours it can produce, a lot of people who have unprocessed childhood sexual abuse can resort to substance abuse, to different ways of self-numbing. The only way to sort of understand that is if we think what has been done to the child. So it's a deeply creative act, but it's a deeply political act. And I want, I'll die in the attempt, but I'm not planning to die in the attempt. But it's really my hardcore material. And one of the things that strongly motivated me was in my 20s, I knew a very, very lovely woman who had been sexually abused by her dad, and she could never confront it. She kept going back to the family home, but sensibly, instead, she drank herself to death. And the last time I saw her, she was really very, very beautiful, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And the last time I saw her, I didn't recognize her at first because she had advanced cirrhosis. She was bright yellow and tiny, and very close to death. And she was in a sort of rough cafe in Notting Hill. This was before Notting Hill became what it is now. She came out of it, and we hugged. And she said someone she knew was buying her breakfast. And if I ever falter, I think of her.
Yeah, that's a horrible thing, but it happens so often.
Yeah, we have to treat ourselves with care. We have to notice the bad things in the world. We have to protect ourselves so they don't overwhelm us, but we have to be informed by them. You know, I saw Rachel Allen Reid last night, who has written and writes on the subject of femicide, of the murder of women by their partners, 2 a week, I think she said. You know, these are very difficult spaces, but someone has to speak for them and has to make art that is not defeated, that is not, quote, raw and confessional, but is, you know, artful and determined. So, and performs acts of beauty.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this work. Could you please read us a poem of your choice?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to read Tessellation, which is a hopeful poem. It's an anorexia poem, and it uses my medical notes at the end. Tessellation. From her bed in the white cloud, Alice watches the commode she uses as a toilet. It is 3 steps away, but cannot be mentioned. She has not been allowed out of this room since she arrived. Pills drop her into nothing at night and hollow out her days. The doctor asks if Alice is feeling better. Alice thinks about the menu cards they make her fill. Within the leather armchair, the doctor's thighs spread warmed marzipan. Alice says she is getting used to being here. The doctor's hair is pulled back into a bun. She suggests that after Alice leaves hospital, she could travel to the desert and learn Arabic. Alice imagines tents and camels and cushions with tiny mirrors. The doctor lights her cheroot, filling Alice's lungs with heavy candy floss. The doctor says, "You must understand you're not your mother. You can only get well if you move far away from her." As the doctor speaks, giant scissors snip round the window. Once these scissors have cut all the way round the frame, Alice rises up, light as a leaf. Cold air is lifting her out into the waiting sky. Alice, both physically and mentally, is much less depressed and more outgoing. I think she is beginning. Letter, Alice Hiller, medical notes, 1st of November, 1977. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice, for sharing this with us.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I've really discovered myself through your interview, Danne. It's been a huge privilege. You're an incredible interviewer. So thank you for the gift of your time and your attention.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much. Thanks again so much to Alice for sharing so openly, and I've put all of her links below. You can buy her book, read her blog. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again soon in the next video. Bye!